13. Just picking it up maybe on line 6 on page 13 at the end of the line. The truths themselves shall endure eternally, this is Badiou, in the space of thought, in the always of time, reopened by philosophy. But the being of the world itself, the world of consciousness and sense and sociality, the world of opinions, is ephemeral, precisely insofar as it is forced by truths. Just here, Badiou's thought intersects revolutionary metanoesis in the negative. That is, the thinking now occurring for the first time would likewise think the being of the world itself, the world of consciousness, sense, and sociality, ephemeral, were it possible for it to think the being of the world a matter of forcing. But an essentially new form of thinking thinks the being of the world to be not a matter of forcing, but a matter of being absolutely unconditioned, a matter of being embodied in omnipotence itself. This absolutely momentous and unprecedented occurrence to thought, being itself thought absolutely, precludes absolutely the coexistence of good and evil, the good of good and evil. There can be no good of good and evil, just as there can be no truth of truth and falsity, where the imperative to create is absolute. Although there can be no good of good and evil, there is a good of evil, just as there is a truth of falsity. It is real. There is a good of good. It is real being. The good is the actual. The good of evil is that it is real non-being. Evil is the real non-being of the good. Real evil, per se, is the non-actual. Evil is actual only as doing without readiness or discretion. Real evil is defection from the absolute now of creating. Evil is not actual as doing without beneficence, unless it is not actually doing without omnipotence. Just here, the actual freedom of creation comes home with the power of the negative. Omnipotence makes possible the actuality of evil as doing without beneficence. The absolute imperative to create, being embodied in existing omnipotence for the first time, is the catholico-logical imperative to create the world. That is, the absolute imperative to create that is operative always and everywhere, from which imperative there is therefore no relief, not even that which might be thought to be found in warding off evil, as if evil were to be looked out for alongside beneficence. If there is actual beneficence, there is no evil. There is omnipotence. There's omnipotence. Thus, the intelligibility of the injunction in Matthew 5:43, love your enemies, and the summary in Matthew 5:48, you be perfect as your magnificent Father is perfect. I've updated the normal translation about Uranios with Heavenly Father, but in the context it doesn't give the real meat of it. Heavenly in the ancient world meant, wow. So you be perfect as your magnificent Father is perfect. You be the simplicity of omnipotence. When readiness is actual, when discretion is actual, one is doing the right thing. When there is the actual good, there evil, otherwise real, is not. But when Badiou empties the resurrection of Christ out of the proclamation Christ is resurrected, as what cannot be assumed to be historical, turning the Pauline proclamation Christ is resurrected into the prototype of the empty form that is a pure, singular, transpersonal subjectivity, neither transcendental nor psychological nor reflexive, that comes to be in fidelity to an event, the generic space of a truth process, he fashions a space of pure subjectivity where evil must be allowed to coexist with the good. Badiou makes room for evil. In the return of philosophy, as taking one more step, a single step, a step within the modern configuration, he inevitably assumes the modern burden of justifying evil. In the preface to the English edition of Ethics, Badiou says, quote, "The subject cannot be conceived exclusively as the subject faithful to the event. This point in particular has significant ethical implications, for I was previously unable to explain the appearance of reactionary innovations. My whole theory of the new confined it to the truth procedures. But when all is said and done, it is obvious that reaction and even the powers of death can be stamped with the creative force of an event. I had already emphasized the fact that Nazism was inexplicable without reference to communism, and more precisely to the revolution of October 1917. I was then obliged to admit that the event opens a subjective space in which not only the progressive and truthful subjective figure of fidelity, but also other figures every bit as innovative, albeit negative, such as the reactive figure or the figure I call the obscure subject, take their place," unquote. Although he eschews the absolute self-consciousness of Hegelian philosophy and would do likewise vis-a-vis the absolute self-emptying of absolute self-consciousness into its own otherness in the theology of Altizer, Badiou's one more single step within the modern configuration brings him into line with the absolute beginning and end of modern subjectivity, brings him, however late or reluctantly, to the acknowledgement that evil has a place of its own within the subjective space opened by an event, just as it does in the subjectivity of the Hegelian absolute idea and in the absolute self-emptying of that subjectivity in the form of Altizer's absolute will. To speak of the justification of evil is to say that evil has standing in the court of the subject. There is room for the standing of evil within the subject precisely because the subject is the remains of the denial of history, of the denial of the identity of the story and the storyteller, the evacuation of the former from the latter. Indeed, the duplicity of the remaining emptiness is both the beginning and the end of the coming to be of the subject. Where the storyteller and the story are identical, where the essence of history is creation, where the imperative is one of actually creating the world, in the ethic of simplicity, evil has no standing room whatsoever. There is no room for the negative figures of the subject who are incompatible with the simplicity of creating. But in that case, there is no need for the incalculable location of noble gestures in the direction of an eternal truth of equality, gestures of generosity repeatedly punching holes in knowledges to make the point, to make the void, over and over again in the face of negation and the repeated triumphs of opinion and the domestication of eternal truths, again and again in the face of defeat. Badiou has given me the opportunity by writing his book on St. Paul.
Yes.
And by taking, as it were, everything from, or abstracting, so to speak, everything from Paul but the historical truth, gives him the form which he then will identify with the subject. In other words, if he hadn't made that abstraction, in the Pauline text, what becomes the subject after you deny the truth of the story, namely Christ is resurrected, that's the truth of the story. Right? If that's denied as something we can't assume that to be true, that's a fable, then I'm left with effectively the storyteller, which is not Paul in the context, it's Christ. Right? So once I take the Christ story out and leave Christ, then I've transformed the Christ of Paul's text into the subject. I've created the form of an empty subject, you see, emptied of its story. And that generic form then can be the form of an infinite number of possible stories. You see, every time it's brought into being by an event. And those stories can be as various as you want, but they're not only is the occasion for them unpredictable, but the content of the subjectivity that is induced by an event is likewise unpredictable or likewise various. You would be the story and the storyteller insofar as you are acting in accord with the ethic of simplicity. To the extent to which, so you, in other words, any person now, that's why I say it's not just the story of Christ, but as a consequence of the story of Christ, that is taking it seriously historically, it is now possible to understand, go back to the zeros and the ones and the, okay? I cannot say I am Christ, but I can say, and I ought to say, that you are Christ. You are the Jesus Christ who is the beginning. I am the zero, but my identity contains, because we're members of the same body, it contains the structure of my identity is your identity with the one. I'm the zero, you're the unum. I am structurally, as it were, the identity of you and the one. In this case, let's say Christ, or the body of Christ.
Okay.
Okay? So So when you asked, the first question you asked was, well, are we talking, I don't know how you phrased it, are we only talking about, well, yes and no. I mean, in other words, we're not only talking about it as if that's the, just to talk about Paul's text and that identity of story and storyteller was the whole story, pardon me saying that, but rather the full implications of that are now intelligible in this thinking are that you are a member of the body of Christ, in effect, and therefore you participate, if I can put it that way, in that same, how shall I say, ability to be, not only participate in the ability to be, but you are obliged to be, I would say. You're under the imperative to create, and insofar as you are fulfilling the imperative to create, you as the storyteller, let's say, and your story are identical. There's no gap within you, because if the gap opened up within you, that opens up in the abstracted subjectivity of Badiou, then you would be inattentive. Then you would, as it were, fall away from doing the right thing. In the thinking now occurring, there is nothing but a kind of absolute eventuality, which is existence itself, or which is the multiplicity of persons. And I think I did say in the first half of this paper, before we broke, I said something like every person is creating or something. So yes, so you could say that if I say that existence itself as a kind of infinite alterity is embodied now for the first time in omnipotence, that's another way of saying there's as it were, an infinite multiplicity, an infinite multiplying of the identity of the story and the storyteller. So, which is another way of saying an infinite multiplying in some sense, in some important sense, of the Christ who is resurrected. Yes, thank you. So I think I was here, in Philosophy and the Death of Communism, Badiou quotes from part of his opera libretto, the Red Scarf, his chorus of the, although in checking that out in the dictionary, a sharp also is the word for the diagonal in construction. And so that's interesting because he thinks of his thinking as a kind of diagonal cut, transversal, as it were, of the, I guess, of the particular. Yeah. All right. His chorus of the divisible defeat, which he calls a chant of announcement, the multiple name of what is always to come. Quote, who then spoke of solitude? Defeated, legendary defeated, I call here for your unacceptance, the crowd of so many others, to have done with what they were, discovering in the declaration of their act the latent separating thought. For of what breaks the circle, nothing is lost. No one forgets ever. The few numbered epochs against the grain, maintainers of the exact idea, in the basements with hand-run presses, thinkers of the obsolete and of the to come. For out of a dimensionless liberty, writing forms the innumerable, for meditation upon what gathers and multiplies will not rest. Nothing is forever disseminated. All of you judge what is lacking and you examine the abolition. Who speaks of failure? What was done and thought was done and thought. In its beginning, its time, and its caesura. That is the pause in the poetic line. Leave the weighing of results to the accountants, for what was at stake in our reign was the invention of separation and not the establishment of the weighty office of adoration. Let me just pause there a moment, because here again there's a certain flavor which the thinking now occurring is very receptive of, very appreciative of, right? And that's the notion of leave the judgment, so to speak, to the accountants, right? That sense, there's a certain sense of abandonment, which has at least some sort of an analogy to the kind of abandonment of self that, except that in the case of the thinking now occurring, I guess you would have to say it's absolute abandonment of self, right? But there is, in some sense, even in Badiou, part of his idealism is the abandonment of self in the sense of that animal self-interest. So there's at least an analogy there. Okay. And the invention of separation also rings a bell with me, because the invention of separation is, again, an incomplete and not radically enough execution of the what you might call the infinite separation in the sense of the absolute discontinuity of the continuum in the thinking now occurring. The infinity of situations, who then will exhaust them? The event in which the dice are cast, who then will appease it? Trust yourself to your imperative, which is nice. Trust yourself, but the imperative part is nice, but the trusting myself is a little bit, it kind of incorporates the hesitation. To turn away from power, that you be indifferent to the verdict, and that nothing in you ever consents to necessity. The satisfied, they can pass on. The fearful, they can proliferate. It is our intact singularity which has made this great hole in the world in which, century after century, the semaphore of communism is fixed. Badiou comments, quote, the glancing light of the semaphore, which is a signaling device that may involve flags or lights, of the semaphore, the illumination of centuries by the rare pivoting insurrection of this light, would this all be extinct because a mediocre tyranny decided to take it upon itself to announce that it was dead? This is exactly what I do not believe, unquote. I'm going to pause there and come back to it because I noticed I've skipped over a footnote on page 15, which I've in effect alluded to, and which bears on this question which is being discussed on page 15. That's why the footnote appears somewhere there, 33. This opening of the space in which the evil figures can have or take their place. I just want to call your attention to the footnote 33. For Badiou, evil is the negative within the space of subjectivity opened by a truth process. Within that space of subjectivity, the figures of evil take their place. The analog of this duplicitous structure of the truth process within the general space of subjectivity opened by the return of philosophy as the sheltering of the compossibility of the truths is sophistry. Sophistry is the denial that there are truths. I mean, that's effectively a quote from, even though it's not literally a quote. Withdrawn from the domains of truth, sophistry exists as the negative twin of philosophy. The irreducibly duplicitous structure of philosophy's situation is testified to by Badiou in Manifesto. Quote, philosophy must never abandon itself to anti-sophistic extremism. It goes astray when it nourishes the dark desire of finishing off the sophist once and for all. No, the sophist must only be assigned to his place, unquote. And what I'm saying, in effect, is that is the deepest analogy to his, not imagining, not being able to conceive of the absolute elimination of evil. Because when he thinks of the concept, when he tries to conceive of an absolute elimination of evil, he can only conceive of it within the limits of subjectivity as what he calls disaster, as attempting to name the unnameable, in effect, at everyone else's expense. Right? In the case of the Holocaust, the stand-in for everyone else, the name of all names of the enemy is the Jew. All right. So, okay, but so there's a deep internal consistency. All right. So even though I'm calling attention critically to the fact that he makes room for evil, just as on the deepest level he makes room for the denial that there are truths. You see. He tolerates, in other words, that negativity because it's an integral part of the duplicity, the duality, the doubleness of subjectivity, and because as long as I hang on to subjectivity to attempt to get rid of evil altogether, or the sophist altogether, would be a disaster because it would be ultimately it would be undoing the subjectivity upon which I'm resting my ever repeated hope. For the world, so to speak. All right. So back onto page 16. After that quote, must be around 10 lines down on page 16. Oh, well, no, even I did that. About 14 lines down, yeah. Communism names the eternity of the equal to which any event which is politically foundational of truth exposes the subject that it induces. The communist invariants are the heroes of what is, unquote. The communist invariants are the heroes of what is always to come, who have as their arenas of action an inexhaustible infinity of situations. This rebellious subjectivity has room for positive and negative figures, indeed positive and negative figures who can take turns enlisting one human animal, a someone, the rebellious Mao and the Mao of the state. Because the ethic of truths hovers above the waters of sense, it glorifies the ever-recurring division of defeat by those who, out of a dimensionless liberty, out of an insensate reason, out of a thinking subtracted from the circulation of sense, break the circle of defeat time and again with a separating thought. And again, for those of you who weren't in those classes in New York, or in the foundation class in particular, probably going over to my simple image of the circle in the thinking now occurring that is an index of the infinite particularity of existence itself, or an index of the absolute discontinuity of the continuum, is I'm just going to do it with my finger. Here's a point, as it were. Here's a point, as it were. I have to add, as it were. Here's a point, as it were, as it were, as it were. And I can make a circle of points, none of which are connected to one another. All right, so right away, they're really not points in the traditional continuum sense, right? But nevertheless, they may form a circle. But of course, they may not. Okay? And so when they form the circle, if the circle is the ideal, you say, just as an image, then they're going to have to do so because each of them independently of the others is going to have to enter into that circle in a kind of perfect freedom. All right, that's the idea. Now, you notice what's really nice about reading Badiou, he's also into breaking up the circle. You see? So I say, hey, great, right, you're on the right track. All right, but he wants to break it, and the problem when he breaks his circle, it keeps putting itself back together again. He can't get it to stay broken. That's his problem. Okay, and so I feel for him. All right, in other words, let's get this damn circle broken altogether, once and for all, finally. That's it. Let's do that, okay? Now, it's been done for us, so we don't have to worry about it, but I'm just saying on a human basis, right? Okay. So break the circle of defeat time and again with a separating thought. The invariant imperative of the truth process is innovation, not to create the world, and so here's the deeper reason, how should I say, ontologically, the reason why his circle keeps healing itself, right? The deeper reason for it is that the process, the truth process, which is involved in introducing the separating thought, all these communist invariants, all these militants over the ages keep arising in unpredictable situations and attempting and maybe even temporarily succeeding in breaking the circle. But the process has to be repeated an infinite number of times. Why? Because the notion that Badiou has, and I think he sometimes uses the word create, it is creative to transform the situation in some sense, you see. It's not creative ex nihilo, though, you see. So it's not creative in the omnipotent sense of the word to innovate, okay? So the process is innovation, not to create the world, but to transform any one of a random infinity of situations, where creation is not essential novation, but merely innovation, not always essentially new shaping, but rather always reshaping, then the carefree leaving of the weighing of results to others is the reciprocal of the essential incompleteness of those results. In his own way, turning American idealism inside out, Badiou parallels pragmatism's infinite postponement of absolute particularity. Now, what I'm talking about here, again, just to fill in the blanks for anybody who needs it, I think I've already alluded to the Peirce's cosmological notion that when Peirce talks about creation, he talks about the absolute first, and he's willing to talk about it as God the creator. He doesn't have to, it's a concession to the popular mind, right? He can talk about it in purely phenomenological terms, I guess you could say. But the origin of the universe is the absolute first, which is God the creator in theological terms, and the end of the universe, absolute second, absolute first, absolute second. Now remember, secondness in Peirce's factuality, it's perfect in and of itself now. It's never found, by the way, it's never actually come upon as pure secondness, right? Because it's always a response to firstness, and it's always being mediated by thirdness, right? But if you abstract the categories, if you could get pure secondness, it would be perfect regularity, which in effect would be a perfect reality that could not be changed. It would be a kind of, in a naturalistic sense, it would be kind of an eternal reality in the sense that you could, it just would no longer be subject to change if you had it. Okay. Now, so if you imagine absolute first and absolute second then would be the absolute realization of the potential that was there in the act of creation by the Creator through time at the goal, so to speak, and this is very Persian. I mean, in this sense, he deliberately resurrects Aristotle, the telos of the evolutionary process, right? For Peirce is the telos is a perfectly, in my language now, a perfectly particularized, a perfectly secondness reality, a perfectly specific reality. Now, for an American pragmatist, thank God, just as for Badiou, analogously, we never actually arrived there. So we're never going to run out of more room before, no matter how close we get to it, even though in American pragmatism, unlike Badiou, there is a kind of, I don't know whether progress is the right word, but there is an evolutionary progress of some sort, an evolutionary tendency toward the realization of this absolute specificity, if you want. We never actually arrived there. All right. So what I'm critical about in that context of American pragmatism, the thinking now occurring when I talk about absolute particularity, what I'm saying is no more of that postponement. We have arrived. This is it. You see, in other words, that the absolute particularity in American pragmatism remains an ideal. So no wonder we haven't realized it. You see, it remains an idea of absolute particularity, right? But what we have is the concrete of absolute particularity here and now. Right? So before we get out of bed, we have arrived. Okay? And when we get out of bed, there's nothing for us to do but to do something with it. Right? That is to create the world, it's called. Okay. So now the reason I'm going over that, in Badiou you have that same kind of postponement in a slightly different context, of course, right? You have the infinite truth procedure, right? Which is never actually completed, as we were saying in a different context the other day. All right. So in that sense, whatever creativity is involved in the execution of a truth procedure is a creativity which, if I put it again in omnipotent terms, does not involve creating the matter. Right? It's a rearranging. Now this is not fair. I think I've used this. Did I use this the first day? It's not fair, but it's easy. So it's too easy. All right. So we'll take it back. But Badiou is rearranging the chairs on the decks of the Titanic. Right. That is, he's not refloating the ship. Right? That's the problem. Okay. And so yes, there is innovation. There is a kind of creativity, but it is not thoroughgoing and absolute. All right, so in his own way, turning American idealism inside out, Badiou parallels pragmatism's infinite postponement of absolute particularity, the infinite postponement of the absolute exhaustion of subjectivity, with the infinite postponement of the ultimate defeat of rebellious subjectivity. Revolutionary noesis sings the praise of the indefeasibility of the human spirit, and who cannot agree with that? I can agree with that. The human spirit is undefeatable. Right? It'll rise from the ashes time and time again. Right? In Badiou's case, the immortality of the rebellious subject, at once the indefeasibility of the void. But revolutionary meta-noesis thinks essentially the indefeasibility of the embodied human spirit, the immortality of the live human body, the question of the resurrection, at once precisely the defeasance of the void. Defeasance is a nice word which I'm using here. It fits in with malfeasance and all those other feasances. It means literally annulment or making void. Okay? So in the thinking now occurring, what we have is the defeasance, the voiding of the void, the annulment of the void, as I say there, the making void the void. Okay, so I've already done that. For the first time, the proclamation of a truth as a singularity absolutely particularized, as a singularity actually embodied in existing omnipotence. The embodiment of the void by omnipotence, together with all that does not contain itself, is precisely the defeasance of the void of thought. But the fullness of thought, that is the actually existing omnipotent defeasance of the void for the first time, is precisely not what Badiou fights against. not the disastrous claim that the circle is unbreakable, nor that the defeat of rebellious subjectivity is complete. In a logic otherwise than containing itself, the logic of simplicity, the subject remains as the possibility of real evil. Not otherwise than containing itself, not containing itself, the subject is the possibility of the will to not be absolutely now. Defection from the good. The subject not otherwise than containing itself, but not containing itself, is the duplicity alternative to the simplicity of existence, the possibility of defection from the good, the possibility of the will not to be contained by another, the will to contain itself, the will blind to the fact that the body exists for the first time otherwise than containing itself, beyond continuity, and blind to the omnipotent embodiment of newness for the first time. Real evil is the refusal in act of the absolute simplicity of existence itself, the refusal in act of the beginning embodied in existing omnipotence. Real evil is doing without actual readiness, without actually being at the disposal of another, or actual discretion, without actually having the patience to see what's different. That is, real evil is actually doing without a possibility of beneficence, without a possibility of doing the right thing. That is, maybe I should slow that reading down a little bit. In other words, I could add, just to make it vivid, it's going ahead and actually doing something, you see, as it were, without beneficence. You see? So actual evil is, so go back to this other little hairy issue we have here, it's a kind of act, but it's an acting in complete disregard of the fact that it's acting without beneficence. Okay. Really, it is actually doing without a possibility of beneficence, without a possibility of doing the right thing, actually doing without a possibility of doing right. But actually doing without a possibility of doing right is real on the condition that it is not actually doing without omnipotence. Omnipotence makes actual real evil, not actual per se, and makes not actual real evil actual per se. I'll make a stab. I'm not going to go too far down this road. I'll make a stab at it.
Just above you sit.
Yeah, it's just above is the answer to your question. In other words, it's the fact that evil cannot actually do without omnipotence. In other words, it's the non-independence of evil that is so thoroughgoing that in whatever sense it is actual, it depends on omnipotence. Yeah, that's right. Okay, the subject is the possibility of real evil, not actual per se. Revolutionary metanoesis is not evil saying that what is must not be, certainly not the assertion of the nothingness of what is, but rather good saying that what is not, and that what there is for the first time absolutely new. The latter involves the absolute novation of the notion of time, indeed of time itself, for the first time. In Foundation, the writer says, quote,
Okay.
just...
I got one more.
Okay, that's okay.
Right,
Not a
okay.
problem. Not a problem.
So, going along with this discussion, so in a certain way, omnipotence
Right.
is basically the source of all action, both creative action and destructive action.
Yes, in one way or another. Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think more proximately what it really is the... It is, but the reason it is that it's the source of real freedom,
Yes.
right? And there's another thought I want to get there. Yeah, and going back to the notion, for example, that it's not anxious and it's open to being surprised and maybe disappointed, you see. So in terms of it's absolutely creative move, if I can put it that way, understood that in the context of everything we've been saying, then in that sense it is the support for, in some sense, the support for evil. But not direct. It's very careful not to say directly, because otherwise you get into Altice's position of saying that the creation of the world involves God's willing evil. I mean, he
No,
says
no, no,
that
no,
boldly.
This basically is the source of all action. It's
Yes,
the
that's
power
right.
of
That's
all
right. And to the
action.
extent to which evil can be actual, then it depends on omnipotence. Yeah,
Right,
that's right.
right.
That's right.
The holy will.
Okay. In Foundation, at the bottom 17, the writer says, quote, "Just here in the midst of the absolute articulation of thought itself, in the absolute harmony itself of the absolute itself, in the midst itself of the perception of the absolute self, in the absolute balance of personality itself, in the perception which is the discrimination of the midst of discrimination itself, as voice itself, itself articulating the absolute word, as the absolute in the midst of saying itself, the absolute saying itself in the midst of saying itself, the absolute absolutely interrupting itself, here in the midst absolutely without spatiality itself, in the identification of the interminable interruption itself, personality manifests itself. Personality itself is manifest as the perception in essence of the voice of God saying itself, I am Christ. Itself, the absolutely unconditioned balance itself, the absolute quality of quantum, the voice of number itself singing the song of the absolute word. The absolute quality of quantum itself is personality. Very existence is the absolute quality of quantum, now thought in essence as itself, the absolute itself saying itself, the Trinity itself quaternal, the very being itself which is Trinity, the manifest individuality of substance itself, the absolute identity of manifest substance, the circle itself, the absolute explosion of identity itself, and then you can think of that perfectly interrupted circle. Substance itself, the manifest Trinity, the absolute minimum. To absolutely discriminate time as absolute substance, to perceive the factuality of the absolutely irreducible form of existence itself, to perceive the factuality of time itself, to perceive the existence of change transcending time as the absolute identity of time, as time itself, to perceive time as time in fact absolutely is, the itself transcendence of time itself, being itself, the absolutely unconditioned immediate mediation of the absolute, number itself, to perceive the absolute itself articulating the being of time is transcendent personality. To hear the word sounding being itself the absolute, this absolute discrimination of the species of perception as being newly articulate, this absolutely historically existent liberation of the essence of thought from the necessity of itself to be distinguished from its own necessity is personality transcendent. Unquote. Revolutionary metanoesis is the transcendence of the pure distinction, noesis, metanoesis, at once the transcendence of the distinction ontology, meta-ontology. Revolutionary meta-ontology, and here I'm not sure how clear we are on this in our discussion or in your reading, but meta-ontology be a way of understanding what Badiou is doing, right? Because for him, ontology is mathematics, but his philosophical enterprise is a meta-ontology, right? So I'm saying the distinction between ontology and meta-ontology, or the distinction as far as Badiou goes, so to speak, has not gone all the way, might be a way of putting it. Revolutionary meta-ontology is absolute noesis, at once poly-ontology. I think I don't know whether it's, yeah, all right. So poly-ontology, if I just abstract some of the language here a minute, to rework it a little bit to make that a little more explicit, the relationship, poly-ontology would be the transcendence of meta-ontology, right? Okay. Or poly-ontology might, in another context, be, and I think it is in another context, probably in Foundation, referred to as an absolute ontology, right? But there is not being, what is being emphasized is not so much the multiplicity of being, the infinite alterity in this context, but if I call poly-ontology absolute ontology, then what I'm saying is that there's nothing but ontology, right? Specifying it as poly-ontology is to say, when there's nothing but, in case you didn't get it, if there's nothing but ontology, and our experience is one of, as Badiou says, what there is an infinite multiplicity, then absolute ontology must be poly-ontology, right? It must be a multiplication, essentially a multiplication of being itself, for want of a better term. Okay, so the absolute noesis is poly-ontology, that is poly-ontology, is the indistinguishing of mathematics and sense. Right? To bring it home to Badiou. The voice of number itself singing the song of the absolute word, all right? I mean, that's in Foundation has already anticipated the critique of Badiou, you see? The absolute quality of quantum itself, unquote, quoting from myself. Polyontological personality whose identity is change, is what it is to discriminate time as absolute substance, is what it is to create the essence of the world. Here can be seen the template of the index of the ethic of simplicity. Quote, again from the quote above, very existence, the Trinity itself quaternal, very being itself, the manifest individuality of substance itself, the circle itself, the absolute explosion of identity itself, the absolute minimum. And just putting it back in arithmetic and logical terms, the 4, 1, 2, 3 order of the ethic of simplicity corresponds to that minimum order. I'm quoting the quoted quote, at the top of 19, where the imperative is to create the world, omnipotence itself having moved to new ground, the nature and magnitude of real evil is infinitely intensified. Real evil is not merely the negative will after the fact. See, in Badiou, there is real evil, right? Of course there is. And his explanation of real evil is that here are the Jews, right? And now we're going to exterminate them, right? So, well, that evil is a negative act after the fact, as it were, after the fact of existence. Do you see what I'm saying? That structure of placing the everyone else in the void and then acting on the fact that they're to be reduced to nothingness, okay? Nevertheless, is after the fact of their existence, as if they're So what I'm saying is that, and you can see in the evil form, the simulacrum form of the truth procedure, you see in its negative form the same fundamental ontological, or meta-ontological in this case, presupposition of Badiou, that there is a pre-existing situation. Or that there is, underneath good and evil, a pre-existing world, which he has no ambition whatsoever, you see, to create, and perhaps not to change, except insofar as that being qua being is presented in a situation. See, so the depth of his of the innovative process is relatively shallow in that respect, right? In other words, so yes, evil is evil there. I mean, no doubt about it, right? But the intensity of evil in the situation in which we are absolutely, as it were, embodied in omnipotence, the intensity of real evil goes up. I would say it goes up infinitely, right? Because we're not just talking about the attempt to make, in his language now, what is not. See, in other words, the evil says that what is must not be, right? Because it isn't one of us. Okay? So all those guys out, the Jews, the Gypsies, the Catholics, and so forth, they must not be. Okay? Because they're not Aryans or whatever. They're not members of the party. But, okay, so that's very bad. That's very bad, right? It's making what is not be, right? And acting accordingly. But what's being said in the thinking now occurring, worse than that in the form of real evil, is not creating. In other words, it's not an evil that's operating after the fact, you see, but it's an evil which in somehow or other is acting as an alternative to the factuality of the world, right? So let me see how I say it here. Where the imperative is to create the world, omnipotence itself having moved to new ground, the nature and magnitude of real evil is infinitely intensified. Real evil is not merely the negative will after the fact, Badiou's that something is presented as having not to be, but rather where for the first time existence is the polyontological identity of being and sense, where the infinite is the finite for the first time. Real evil is that the fact of existence for the first time has to have not been prepared for, has to be not perceived discreetly, has to be not shaped by right doing. Real evil is the not willing not to, that for the first time, not actually doing without omnipotence, actually goes, albeit actually defeasible, to the very essence of creating the world. The unprecedented scope of actually defeasible real evil is a function of the gift of freedom now actually existing for the first time in the form of thought. It is from this latter that the duplicity of willing is for the first time actual defection. In the section of ethics entitled Outline of a Theory of Evil 1, Simulacrum and Terror, Badiou writes, quote, "We have seen that not every novelty is an event. It must further be the case that what the event calls forth and names is the central void of the situation for which this event is an event. It should be easy to understand that since the event is to disappear, being a kind of flashing supplement that happens to the situation, so what is retained of it in the situation and what serves to guide the fidelity must be something like a trace or a name that refers back to the vanished event. When the Nazis talked about the National Socialist Revolution, they borrowed names, revolution, socialism, justified by, great modern political events, the Revolution of 1792 or the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. A whole series of characteristics are related to and legitimated by this borrowing. However, the event thus named, although in certain formal respects it is similar to those from which it borrows its name and characteristics, and without which it would have no constituted political language in which to formulate proposals of its own, is distinguished by a vocabulary of plenitude or of substance, plenitude or substance, so that the event is supposed to bring into being and name not the void of the earlier situation, but its plenitude, not the universality of that which is sustained precisely by no particular characteristic, no particular multiple, but the absolute particularity of a community, itself rooted in the characteristics of its soil, its blood, and its race. When a radical break in a situation under names borrowed from real truth processes convokes not the void, but the full particularity or presumed substance of that situation, we are dealing with a simulacrum of truth. Fidelity to a simulacrum regulates its break with the situation not by the universality of the void, but by the closed particularity of an abstract set, the Germans or the Aryans. The void, avoided by the simulacrous promotion of an event substance, here returns with its universality as what must be accomplished in order that this substance can be. This is to say that what is addressed to everyone, and everyone here is necessarily that which does not belong to the German communitarian substance, for this substance is not an everyone, but rather some few who dominate everyone, is death, or that deferred form of death which is slavery in the service of the German substance. The name Jew was the name of names, serving to designate those people whose disappearance created around that presumed German substance a void that would suffice to identify the substance. In the ethic of truths, every someone is always represented, and now he's drawing he's now going to say why that's a perversion and a distortion of the ethic of truths, properly understood in its original and non-simulacrous form. And the first thing he points out is that in the ethic of truths, every someone is always represented as capable of becoming the immortal that he is, right? So there's Badiou's notion of universality, even though he has this ongoing contemptuous attitude toward someone's in their human animality, in their natural socialized individuality. He does have, there's no question, but he has that contempt. Nevertheless, it's not an unbridled contempt, right? He imagines the possibility that everyone, even of those animals, as human, has the possibility of exceeding themselves by participating in the immortality of a subjectivity, right? And so, therefore, you see, what he calls the communitarian particularism of Nazism, right? At the most fundamental level, yes, it's projecting the void, the logical void, outside of itself as a void in being, and then saying that these guys who are on the outside, who are, must not be, because they really embody somehow or other the void. You say, yes, that's true. But now he's saying, well, what's the fundamental reason for that? What is the fundamental perversion, right? And it's that Because after all, you could say that the Jew in the concentration camp was really embodied the contemptibility of the human animal, right? You see what I'm saying? Unjustifiably from Badiou's point of view. But in other words, how is it possible you could define everyone else who is not a member of our group? How could you define them as worthy of death, in effect? That's what it comes down to, you see. They're contemptible, and as he said earlier in a different context, more generally speaking, the human animal per se is contemptible, and sure enough, it will be held in contempt, all right? Which sooner or later will lead to death, all right? So what does it mean that everyone else, the Jew being the exemplary everyone else, was contemptible and deserved to be put to death, in addition to the notion of the void part? The other thing is that what was denied to those human animals was what Badiou understands to be the universal possibility of all human animals, whether they realize it or not, okay, of exceeding themselves, right? So in other words, all human beings, so the universality which was denied by the Germans cuts in a number of different ways simultaneously, right? And one way in which it cuts is that what was denied to the others was their capacity to not be contemptible, right? To rise above themselves in some sense, right? They were reduced, in other words, to merely being human animals. So Badiou, that's where Badiou, at that point, he leaves off from the negative direction, the negative attitude that he has toward the human animal is quite clearly restricted. In the ethic of truths, every someone is always represented. Every someone is the key point. Every someone is always represented. That is, universally, human animals are always understood to be capable of becoming the immortal that he is. So we may fight against the judgments and opinions he exchanges with others for the purpose of corrupting every fidelity, but not against his person. All right? So this is nice because it shows that despite all the negative things he has to say about what we're calling persons, nevertheless, but you'll notice why it's not going to be an attack on the person. He has some regard for the person as a person being able to become a subject, right? Which, under the circumstances, here's the point. The person, nevertheless, he's not about to exterminate these persons, but nevertheless, one of the reasons we're not going to do it is that it's besides the point. The person is, in any event, under the circumstances, is insignificant, and to which, in any case, every truth is ultimately addressed. The positive side being the ultimate address of the truth to all, the same for all idea. It's the same for all persons. It gives them the opportunity to realize their chance of immortality, to speak his language. All right. By contrast, the void with which those who are faithful to a simulacrum strive to surround its alleged substance must be a real void obtained by cutting into the flesh itself. And since it is not the subjective advent of an immortal, so fidelity to the simulacrum presumes nothing more about those they designate as the enemy than their strictly particular existence as human animals. It is thus this existence that will have to bear the return of the void. This is why the exercise of fidelity to a simulacrum is necessarily the exercise of terror, unquote. For Badiou, terror is what follows when, in the perverse imitation of a truth process, a particular community of human animals enlisted in a simulacrum of a subject is subtracted from the universal, with the ensuing reversal in which everyone becomes everyone else, who are seen as outside the possibility of being anything more than the contemptible human animals they in fact are, and who are treated accordingly, sooner or later put to death. What Badiou accepts as unavoidable is that given the fact that the structure of a truth process is founded on the duplicitous structure of subjectivity, its perverse imitation is practically inevitable. Indeed, the practical inevitability of the perversion of the truth process is unavoidable as long as Badiou is committed to taking one more step, albeit a single step, within the modern configuration, within subjectivity. What does not and cannot occur to Badiou, given his commitments, is that at the root of the practical inevitability of the perversion of truth is the notion of the same. Badiou is committed to the return of the same. He reads Paul's universal address as the exemplary instance of his ethical notion, the same for all. For Badiou, the returning, and by the way, let me just pause there because I had another thought when I was going through the Nazi thing. It's deeply connected with this, but I want to articulate it just in case it gets lost. Notice, therefore, even though I'm calling attention to the limitation that Badiou puts upon his contempt for the human animal. I mean, you could say, nevertheless, he shares with the evil figure, in this case Nazism, you see, he shares a certain minimum contempt. Right? You say, in other words,
the possibility that the human isn't human.
In the sense, right? That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's right. That's very good. Okay. Okay, and that is, and so that notion of the same for all. In other words, the thinking now occurring is cutting beyond that, or cutting out, or moving after the notion of the same for all, after the notion of same and self and so forth and so on, and that coincides the reduction of immortality to all. But all where all are infinitely particularized, and therefore where, in a certain sense, while everyone is immortal in their absolutely particular concrete being, right? And therefore, not only are they not in any pedestrian sense, is no one the same as anyone else. No one's immortality is the same as anyone else. One does not have to join together in order to achieve immortality at the sacrifice of one's concrete particularity. All right, so Badiou is committed to the return of the same. He reads Paul's universal address as the exemplary instance of his ethical notion of the same for all. For Badiou, the returning, and now I'm kind of characterizing him in shorthand, the returning of Hegel Marx, the hyphen is important. He's not a return of either one of them apart from the other. Post-mortem Dei, after the death of God. Evil is the substitution of a closed, particular, pre-existing subjectivity for the coming to be of a particular subjectivity universally addressed. Throughout, Badiou takes for granted the ultimate mortality of the living human animal. Both the authentic subject and the simulacrum, the latter perversely, convoke mortal human animals to exceed themselves in the always of time. But there is no expectation of the transformation of the mortal human animal as such. There is no expectation of the coming into being of the apocalyptic end of time. There is no thinking essentially the resurrection of the body. In the irreducibly duplicitous space of the ethic of truths may be seen, in the negative, the intimate relationship that exists between the core of Paul's proclamation, excised by Badiou, and the possibility of an actually or fully ethical existence. The simplicity, and here I'm going over again, a distinction that appears earlier in the text, the simplicity that the proclamation Christ is resurrected, eis Christon, and I have already explained earlier in the text that the eis there is the proclamation Christ is resurrected is as it were, the relation to Christ. Right? Paul's proclamation is in the resurrected Christ, is in Christo. The simplicity, which is that the proclamation Christ is resurrected, is in the resurrected Christ, assures Paul of the transformation of the human animal. As he says in Philippians 3:20-21, quote, "For our citizenship, polytuma, begins where God is." And that's my translation again. I'm trying to avoid this kind of cliche in the heavens, right? So Uranus, the heaven, was where the gods dwelled, right? So for Paul, for whom there's only one God, when he speaks of God being in the heavens, he's really talking about where God is. Our citizenship begins, he says, and he does use the word begin, so where God is, from where we expect the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will meta-schematize. And that's what he actually says in the Greek. I loved it when I found that. I mean, it's so neat. It was very nice of him to do that. We expect the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will meta-schematize the body of our lowliness, which is literally what that says in the Greek, shaped like the sumphoron, sormophon, the body of, shaped like the body of his glory. Right? So let me just pause there. So it's clear in Paul's text, and what I'm trying to give you is the reason why Paul says that. In other words, it's not a bare, bald assertion that we're expecting to have our bodies re-schematized, right? Reconstituted, reformed, or something like that. Or say created anew might be a way of getting at it. Yes, you could say that, and he does say that, right? But I'm saying, well, why does he say that, right? He says that because it's deeply connected to the fact that the relationship to Christ only is in Christ. If we are not already embodied in Christ, you say, there would be no ground, as it were, for making this claim that we are expecting to be re-schematized in the flesh, if I can put it in Badiou's terms, you see. Okay, so not simply the Platonism of the multiple, thinking the revolutionary exceeding of human animality. All right, so yes, I can, and so in that sense, Badiou is not original. I mean, this is the most ancient of Platonic ideas, right? In other words, and Paul is very much aware of this distinction, right? Paul, somewhere in a passage which I do not quote in this text, because he speaks metaphorically, and I just didn't feel I wanted to use it. But Paul talks about wanting to be not wanting to be stripped bare. That is, not wanting to be taken out of our bodies, but rather to be reclothed. All right, and certainly in the ancient world, any Platonist listening would understand the implications of that. In other words, in the Platonic mindset, and that's Badiou's mindset, resurrected, as it were, resuscitated maybe. Immortality is getting beyond my animality, right? The notion of my animality being meta-schematized, you see, my body being reconstituted as such, as body, as immortal, that's not Platonic, it's not Badiou-esque, and it's certainly not Paul. All right, so not simply the Platonism of the multiple thinking, the revolutionary exceeding of human animality, but the notion of the meta-schematizing of the body that forms the core of revolutionary metanoesis. In ethics, Badiou says, quote, every age, and in the end none is worth more than any other, has its own figure of nihilism. The names change, but always under these names, ethics, for example, we find the articulation of conservative propaganda with an obscure desire for catastrophe. It is only by declaring that we want what conservatism declares to be impossible, and by affirming truths against the desire for nothingness, that we tear ourselves away from nihilism. The possibility of the impossible, which is exposed by every loving encounter, every scientific refoundation, every artistic invention, and every sequence of emancipatory politics, is the sole principle against the ethics of living well, whose real content is the deciding of death, of an ethic of truths, unquote. Badiou looks for the possibility of the impossible. In rejecting Paul's message as a fable, as an historical impossibility, Badiou rejects the actuality of the impossible and settles for the possibility of the impossible. This is the conservatism of the revolutionary, where Paul speaks of a new foundation in Christ, which is literally the kaine ktisis, sometimes translated, and by the way, it's not at variance. I mean, that's a nice word, because it means foundation, and Paul's saying kaine, new foundation, but it can also be, and often is translated, and perhaps more often translated, as creation. And probably should be more properly translated as either foundation or creating, as an active, not as an object, right? So there's a new creation, there's a new foundation, there's a new creating, and so where Paul speaks of a new foundation in Christ, saying, look, the new has come into being, Badiou speaks of refoundation, in this case, in the case of science. But Badiou does not look for the actuality of the impossible. He wants what conservatism declares to be impossible, but he thinks the impossibility of conservatism to be impossible. Right? So his acceptance of the irreducibility of sophistry, his analogous acceptance of the irreducibility of evil in human existence, you see? His parallels on a more broad social critique basis. It parallels his his acceptance of the irreducibility of conservatism. You see, and in that, to the extent to which he shares, you see, I would say in the I could put it just baldly, in the lack of faith of all of those guys. When he speaks of the fact that the void with which those who are faithful to a simulacrum strive to surround its alleged substance, I must have missed the. The fact that must be a real void. The fact that it must be a real void obtained by cutting into the flesh itself. Badiou has already accepted that this void made by cutting into flesh is the dark literal of the shining spiritual, that it again and again makes a hole in sense. See? A hole in the world, because in effect it cannot assume the resurrection to be historical, cannot believe that any age is worth more than any other. Right? So it's a kind of, it is, Chuck characterizes kind of, there's a romantic flavor here, but if we just more pedestrian about it, there's a kind of eternal, perpetual spinning of one's wheels, right? It would seem. There doesn't seem to be any traction here. See? The event of omnipotence itself moving to new ground neither brings into being, all right, now, this is a way of making clear, having listened carefully to Badiou's fears about claims that form evil, right? The event of omnipotence itself moving to new ground neither brings into being, nor does it name the void of the earlier situation, which is one of the things that the evil subject does. But this omnipotent actual embodiment of existence for the first time annuls the notion of situation together with its void, whether that void be named or masked as plenitude. The substance or actual plenitude of body, embodied for the first time in omnipotence itself, as such at once the defeasance of the void, the resurrected body is not and cannot be an alternative to the void. It is not a solid that might be reduced to a mass point, nor a circle that might be reduced to a vanishing point, nor a line that might be reduced to a moving point. The resurrected body beginning is the absolute discontinuity of a fourth dimensional continuity. The body embodied in omnipotence itself is an infinitely open, infinite particularity beginning, infinite particularity of beginning. In Foundation, the writer says, quote, in the delicate factuality of transparent identity, complementarity itself is absolutely transcended. Memory itself absolutely coincides with perception, absolutely exists in the delicate transparency of perception. The simulacrum, which is no simulacrum, the product of an absolute repetition, identity itself. Indeed, memory itself for the first time is the absolute transcendence of the negation within actuality by actuality itself. In memory itself for the first time, there is absolutely no trace, no repetition of the becoming itself of absolute subjectivity, no repetition of repetition itself, no actual trace of trace itself. The absolute indifference of memory itself to becoming itself is identity itself absolute. Identity is the absolutely unconditioned indifference of memory itself to becoming. There is no non-identity arising out of the repetition of perpetuity, while the original absolute non-identity was a perpetual non-existence. There is the absolute repetition of absolute existence, the perpetuity of existence itself. There is absolutely no alternative to actual identity. The absolute other of identity itself is not other than it, because absolute identity itself is not other than. It's other, but not other than, unquote. What Foundation says in contradiction to the becoming itself of absolute subjectivity is to be said of the singular subjectivity in the Return of Philosophy. There is no trace of the event that is not the event. In the thinking now occurring for the first time, it has been decided once and for all against the continuum that supports the negative in the relation of trace and event. The trace is absolutely the event. The schema of the meta-schematized body is existence itself for the first time. This precludes the structure of the subjective moment of crisis in the Ethic of Truths. In the section of ethics entitled Outline of a Theory of Evil 2, Betrayal, Badiou writes, quote, under pressure from the demands of interest, or on the contrary, because of difficult new demands within the subjective continuation of fidelity, there is a breakdown of the fiction I use to maintain, as an image of myself, the confusion between my ordinary interests and disinterested interest, between human animal and subject, between mortal and immortal. At this point, I am confronted with a pure choice between the keep going proposed by the ethic of this truth and the logic of the perseverance in being of the mere mortal that I am. What I am then exposed to is the temptation to betray a truth. I must betray the becoming subject in myself. I must become the enemy of that truth, whose subject, the someone that I am, accompanied perhaps by others, composed. So it is that the defeat of the ethic of a truth as the undecidable point of a crisis presents itself as betrayal, unquote. At the midpoint of the ethic of truths, at the pivotal moment of fidelity, Badiou suddenly abandons the meta-ontological structure of his ethic of truths in favor of the notion of a psychological crisis. Evil here would be to succumb to the temptation to betray a truth. Badiou's ethic of truths is suddenly betrayed by the void. He says, in itself, a truth process is untouched by crisis. What can go into crisis is the one or several someones who enter into the composition of the subject induced by this process. It's not only that the subject justifies evil in the sense I've explained, which I won't repeat, right? But the subject won't take the responsibility for the failure of the truth process it bears. It's going to shove it off on this poor someone who couldn't sustain the process in what is a practically, if the thing goes on long enough. I love Percy, if we live long enough, we'd all come to absolute ruin and disaster. Instead of that, we have death. Okay? So analogously, you see, this infinitely unrealizable truth process, if it goes on long enough, sooner or later, everybody's going to break down. I mean, that's what Peirce would tell him. That was Peirce would tell him.
That's
right?
why you have the repetition. That's why.
Yeah. That's right. Yes. That's right. That's a function of that. That's right. So I'm just noticing as I'm reading this to you that the subject is letting itself off the hook here, and that's what I mean by the psychological as opposed to the meta-ontological. All of a sudden, he abandons the meta-ontological, and then he makes the point of saying, as far as the truth process goes, it's untouched by the crisis. It's not in crisis. It goes through no crisis. All right. So in itself, a truth process is untouched by crisis. What can go into crisis is the one or several someones who enter into the composition of the subject induced by this process, unquote. But then the continuation of the truth process depends upon the unchallenged, plausible fiction, or fictions, of the unity of subject and someone, or someones, or, in the event of crisis, the pure choice, without support, to keep going or to betray a truth. The ultimate support of a truth process, the support of the bearer of a fidelity, the support of the subject of a truth, is someone's psychological fiction of his own unity, or in the event that fiction fails, someone's pure, unsupported choice. The ultimate support of an ethic of truths is not a matter of ethics. It is the void. Such indeed is the rebellious subjectivity that despairs of changing the world, which I think is the point that Waltraud is just pointing to. In the section of ethics entitled Outline of a Theory of Evil 3, the unnameable, where Badiou turns his attention to the change brought about by a truth process, he says, the important thing is that the power of a truth directed at opinions forces the pragmatic namings, the language of the objective situation, to bend and change shape upon contact with the subject language. We can now define what the total power of a truth would be. Now the key word there is total, right? So he's going to define what a total power of truth, and that's bad. That's evil. What we can now define what the total power of a truth would be. It imply the ability to name and evaluate all the elements of the objective situation from the perspective of the truth process. Rigid and dogmatic or blinded, the subject language would claim the power based on its own axioms to name the whole of the real and thus to change the world. The hypothesis of total power here has consequences. In the first place, we thereby presume that the totality of the objective situation can be organized in terms of the particular coherence of a subjective truth. We next assume that it is possible to eliminate opinion. A truth would then force the pure and simple replacement of the language of the situation by a subject language. That is to say, the immortal would come into being as the wholesale negation of the human animal that bears him. And in effect, what he's now going to say is that would be an absolute self-contradiction to the subjective bearer of the truth. But every truth presumes, in fact, in the composition of the subjects it induces, the preservation of someone, the always two-sided activity of the human animal caught up in truth. Truths make their singular penetration only through the fabric of opinions. It is we ourselves, as ourselves, who expose ourselves to the becoming subject. There is no history other than our own. There is no true world to come. The world as world is and will remain beneath the true and the false. There is no world that might be captive to the coherence of the good. The world is and will remain beneath good and evil. The good is good only to the extent that it does not aspire to render the world good. Its sole being lies. Now, of course, the premise of that last statement is that the world is beneath